Why, hello and welcome. And well, Windows in the disk cache. It depends on a lot. Windows 11 is like Windows 10 and Windows 7. In that if you don't, a lot of people are like, we only need 32 gigs or 16 gigs. Yes, Windows works, but it's not the optimal amount of RAM for the disk cache, which I know no one ever talks about. It's just a wonderful feature, and everyone just appreciates it for what it is, and then just ignores it in the background. And in Windows 11, it's optimized, I've noticed, for about 64 gigs of RAM. Windows 10 was 32, Windows 7 was 16. Yes, you could run the OS on less, and yes, it would work, but you started doing what's known as disk thrashing, almost, effectively, because it would be constantly reallocating and changing the size of the disk cache, and you get below that 64 gig, it starts doing weird stuff. And it starts to actually impact your gaming performance and how smooth the operating system is, because it's constantly hitting the I/O. And yes, you can see my other diagram up here, but it's constantly changes. So what I did back in Windows 10 on a mechanical hard disk was I manually reset the minimum disk cache. Since on a mechanical hard disk, that meant that it acted like it had free RAM. It really didn't. But it saved the drive from constantly having to save the size of the disk cache. And Windows wasn't giving it enough. Because what had happened is, since it was dynamic, but I only had 16 gigs, I think I only had 16 gigs of RAM, which really wasn't enough. Windows was just constantly reallocating it, which was on a mechanical hard drive, is that noticeable. It does not like file size, it doesn't like that change over and over and over and over again, that constant dynamic. So I reset it according to PCs for Dummies from the 90s, where it said just 2.5 times RAM, and I did that, and it was a noticeable performance improvement, even on a mechanical hard disk on Windows 10. Having that disk cache actually function properly. Now, I reset the minimum, and I do not like monkeying around in OSs like this to manually reset settings. And, right now we're having Windows and the whole 50 gig, 60% drives, and I've heard all kinds of things, and then I remembered, oh yeah, it's summer. So here's how I would lay out a Windows, actually how I have laid out my computer. I don't know what else example to use. And no, these aren't actually the sizes of my drives, but a game drive, the first drive that's going to take the most wear and tear, and you should put the absolute minimum on, is your operating system drive. That disk cache is running all the time on Windows. Constantly reading and writing and changing its size. This is basically all the time. And, it's constantly doing this, bouncing basically between these states, and it's trying to get, it really wants to run like this, but it tends to end up looking like this sometimes. And it'll over-allocate if you don't have enough RAM, and it starts over-disk caching, as people have pointed out in one video. And it's because there's just, Windows needs that 64 gig, that's the balance point between where the operating system is happy and most of your software. Now, the less you use the disk cache, the longer your OS drive will last. Yes, people have burned them up from not having enough. So I'll put it this way. RAM is cheap. Storage is expensive. When I looked up in 2008 or 2009 how much a drive recovery was, it was more expensive than RAM. It was over $200 at that time. And I don't know how expensive it is now. Someone's probably got some budget out there. But RAM is less than $200 to go from 32 to 64 gigs. Just go buy the RAM. It's cheaper. As I found out, at least for proper ECC DDR5, it's temperature sensitive. And that, to me, would mean that probably the regular DDR5 is also temperature sensitive and has been quietly downclocking itself when it gets too hot. Modern computers run really hot. Very small components, lots of power in a small space. It's like an electric stove. It's going to run hot. And the 64 gigs helps because then your CPU, you're using fewer CPU cycles, constantly hammering this drive. And you want your games in a different drive because then they're independent. If you're running everything, off of just the disk cache, you're really hitting this drive. The back and forth between this is really high because that I/O controller there is having to manage not just your operating system's disk cache, but the game. And now we have streaming textures, which means you're putting even more strain on it. And it's having to, if it's an SSD, dynamically reallocate things for the load leveling, wear leveling inside the little cells in it. So you want to put as little strain on these drives as possible. Game drive, this is where I put a refurbished, obviously not your antique copy of La Mulana from before they charged for it, or Cave Story, but your original freeware versions, which now would be almost 20 years old. Don't put those on this drive. They go on the important things drive and you back them up. They're like grandma's, pictures of grandma, birthdays, holidays. Put those on an important drive. Do not put with the games, and definitely don't put them on the OS drive. This is the most likely to fail drive because it does the most work out of all the drives in your computer. If you're using like me, I have DaVinci Resolve. 64 gigs is nice because, well, none of my files get that big. I can tell it to just have a 32 gig or 16, on my laptop that's 32 gigs, but 64, I can give it 32 gigs of RAM to use as its swap file. And guess what? The operating system is still pretty happy with the 32 underneath, no problem. So, and cooling, just get fans. Don't worry so much about brand if you're on a budget. What matters more is that you fill your case with as many audibly acceptable fans to you, because one high quality fan isn't going to move as much air as 3 average quality fans. Like I have a bunch of Thermaltake in my case. It's got nothing but Thermaltakes, and they're not the high end ones, and it's pretty quiet. You really can't hear it in the background even after my audio cleanup. It's pretty quiet because 3 fans can run at a lower speed and move more air, and you want your case to have as even of airflow as possible, because what's probably causing the Windows bug is too much over-reliance on this one disk. It's getting absolutely hammered. It's having to load wear level. It's having to handle the disk cache and loading the games, and then on top of that, if you're logging data, you're logging that on. And that's a lot for that controller to really do. That's a lot of heat, because that's a lot of processes using energy, and if you don't have heatsink on that, people were pointing out even with DDR4, they were slowing down from overheating, and this was like 3 or 4 years ago or more with PCI Gen 4 M.2s. Was heat's an issue, and that's probably why they shut it during the summer. Now, will Microsoft probably get any telemetry? Probably not, because the operating system ceases to be when the OS drive is the one that fail-safes. You're not going to get anything out of it. That would explain why they wouldn't, because if the operating system is there, it can't call home. Because technically it ceased to be, the computer crashes, and you end up at your boot screen for the internal firmware, the Universal Firmware Interface, whatever they call it, otherwise known as the Basic Input-Output System, even though it's no longer just a basic input-output system, otherwise known as a BIOS. But keep the computer clean, make sure you got enough fans, plenty of airflow. If you can't really control your house's temperature that well, make sure you got heat sinks on everything. Make sure they're clean, make sure there's no plastic. You double check you haven't left the plastic wrapper on the thermal pads for the heat sinks for the M.2s, or buy M.2s to come with heat sinks. That isn't always the best idea, because sometimes you end up with your M.2 drive under something and it won't fit. I would recommend getting a motherboard that has by default heat sinks on all of the M.2 drives built into the motherboard. They'll fit, and then they'll have clearance, and they'll be properly attached. Maybe they're not the world's greatest, but fill the case with fans and watch them cool. The more you split up your stuff, if this and this are working together, these 2 controllers now are working together. Not the same data set, but this drive is only having to handle Windows, and this is only having to handle the game files. And that means that it doesn't get as hot. It has more time to cool back down, and it isn't getting hammered all the time. Because processes will stack up in a queue, and then it'll just sit there and get hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter and use more power. And as it uses more power, it does become less efficient. Because the resistance goes up as heat goes up. And, have your important things drive. Have that. Recordings. Definitely have, like I have a recordings drive. It's a mechanical hard disk. It's fine. I only record at like 12 megabits a second. 30 FPS. So that's more than enough on 125 on a mechanical disk. It's actually kind of files it likes. They're long, boring, and similar. These really like your little choppy files, the SSDs. And no, those aren't the actual specs of my drives. But I just, I watched Jay's video, and I was left with questions. And I know he's busy. He needs to go make his 5090 video. But I was left with the question was there a heatsink on that drive? How much RAM? And I do know that he was running the game, his telemetry recording, and the operating system on one drive, which is a lot to ask of it, even with M.2. We're used to being able to hide behind that speed, but as these drives get faster, they run hotter. I actually have the model of drive he has. And this is going on, if you don't have, 64 gigs, Windows starts to thrash this thing. And that's a lot to ask. It's, and with that, as I found out from Level 1 Text, the silent RAM throttling, might as well just buy 64. It's usually about twice as much as 32 now, but since you're not gaining probably the hundreds of milliseconds of lag from this, and the game and the OS competing for bandwidth out of that drive, because the drive is way slower than RAM. Windows likes to put everything in RAM. It prefers to leave your game and the whole software in RAM. It is the fastest and most accessible, and RAM is designed to be used like that. It's an infinite scratch pad, effectively. Commodore 64 RAM, and it's failing in the Commodore 64 in 2010, 2020, 2025, and these were budget game machines, and that's sometimes up to 40 years after the Commodore 64 machines were leaving the plant. That is so far out, and some of that RAM wasn't even all that great. It was marginal then, that probably in the time you're using your DDR5, you're not going to worry about it. And it's way better being now. But Windows 7, get heatsink. Make sure you have a properly cooled computer, at least. Even if you can't afford AC, make sure you got your heat sinks. Make sure the dust isn't on everything. Make sure the thermal pads don't have plastic. Make sure you have 64 gigs of RAM. Windows will be much happier. I put 64 gigs in a Windows 11 machine with a 5600 AMD-X, went to 64 gigs. Even though the RAM got downclocked, it played Total War, Three Kingdoms noticeably faster. And I think it was all just down to disk cache, because it didn't have to spend as much time dealing with disk cache. And the CPU was happier because it wasn't having to recalculate all the time as much of the disk cache. And I know it's a pretty efficient algorithm, but when it's doing this, it doesn't matter how efficient it is if it's constantly being called. You want it to look like this or this, not too small, nearly too small, working on way too small. You want it nice and green, and that usually happens when you have more RAM. Windows doesn't have to work as hard, and that frees up more cycles for your game and rendering physics, and makes things more stable and puts less wear and tear on your OS drive. The amount of I/O instructions you're asking the CPU and the bus to handle are probably enough that, I remember looking at TechPower's graph, and the amount you had to spend to go to faster RAM, going to what the CPUs were rated for, AMD and Intel said, was for 2 sticks, which was at the time 52 and 5600 megahertz, whatever, times 2 on DDR5, was marginal after you hit that. It was a very small gain, but the amount you had to spend started to soar. And at that point, you want to move the bottleneck here. You want the bottleneck to be in the fastest parts possible. You don't want it to be here. You don't want it here. You can, there's always going to be a bottleneck in your computer. The best thing to have the limiting factor be is actually the CPU's bus, and you still want it to be, you can reduce the strain on it, like splitting these up, or having more RAM reduces the strain on it. Yes, it has to refresh and find things, but it isn't having to find this, check instructions, check this, blah, 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 blah. You start ending up with this going on, and it's like, what are you doing to me? It much prefers to be, oh yeah, it's right here. I got it. No having to have ask the CPU to look in the RAM table to find out where it went in the disk cache, look up the disk cache table, then it comes back over here, and then it gets put back in RAM, and it uses it, and then it has put back, and then it goes over here, and you can see how very quickly this becomes complicated. It's better to just split it all up. Look, it helps the OS. This disk cache thing is a thing, and it's an important part of modern operating systems, but, well, that helps someone out there, like, I have my important things drive, and a recordings drive, but splitting it up splits out the heat. You want to spread out the heat in the system because it means it's easier for this drive to get cooled since it's not having to do as much, which makes it easier for this drive to be cooled because it isn't having to do as much. And yeah, it's not a lot of power, but when you take 3 watts and turn it into something, that fits on the edge of your fingernail, that's a lot of heat in a small spot. Or, it can really add up. And I think a lot of these failures are just heat and overwork overstressing of a drive, as in the VISA controller is acting perfectly fine. It's working as expected. It explains why there's no corrupted data. It's working normally. I think what it is a good guess, I can't say, is that they're overworked, overheating drives because it's summer. And unfortunately, you're not going to have much celebrity when your OS drive ceases to be on. I mean, the drive's fine, but when the OS can't talk to its other half, it's, this cache is like, RAM is like putting a better door on your back of your house. Fewer leaves get in the fall, so you don't have to spend as much time sweeping. It's normal housekeeping for the file system. And just go get more RAM. Don't worry about the speed so much. Max out with your your CPU supplier says, or you might get stuck with Kingston if you have a laptop, so you can run it, the 32 or 48, because Kingston's nice. They have the JEDEC specs on their RAM usually, and you can go look it up and put in your laptop if you can't get into the BIOS, and it'll run at the higher speed. Yeah, higher clock rate's great, but having enough is great too. If you don't have enough, well, for Windows to be happy as in optimal, working is not the same as optimal. And optimal means that, it's like you buy a car and it's supposed to run on premium, but you can get away with regular because you don't have any money that day. And you need to get home, and you live in a state that will give you a $200 ticket if you run out of gas. Well, go buy regular and get home. Yes, the car won't be happy, but the car will survive. It just won't be happy and won't get as good a mileage. But the ticket's way more expensive than the gas that you're trying to save, usually. Turn the ticket money into gas money, and then tomorrow maybe you can get your proper gas for your car. It works, but it's not the best. And a lot of this is down to, I'm from the Windows 98 era, when I learned how to put a computer together with socket 7 motherboards for the most part. And that's kind of like where, that was like the big socket of the 90s was socket 7, because that's, I think, where Pentium MMX showed up, which would be, 95, 96, and it was still being used in 2001 on all of people's computers. And then people tried to put laptop CPUs in it from AMD. It had an interesting about socket 7 motherboards. But, and I don't know how to fix it all. Make sure you have your chipset drivers up to date. Make sure the firmware on your drive's up to date. Make sure your BIOS is up to date. There's been a lot of security things that AMD and Intel have patched recently. You know, you're not a debugger. Just make sure you know how to do it. Find someone who's trustworthy to run it, to update these things. If you don't know how, it's fine. You can usually find someone. I know people don't like the bloat that comes with motherboards, but boy, sometimes it's nice to have for managing this stuff, because that chipset driver sometimes can get really out of date. And Windows and AMD does recommend, I know them because I have AMD computers, does recommend keeping that chipset driver up to date. And that's sometimes kind of tricky. Sometimes their graphics driver does it, sometimes it doesn't. I know that the interface for whatever it is, the interface for Gigabyte's interface has a lot of those driver updates in their controller, whatever it is, hub. Really handy. You know, yes, I know Armoury Crate, but if all you're running is Asus, and more Asus, then Armoury Crate's fine. Or Gigabyte, just, if everything's Gigabyte, just run the Gigabyte Control Center. It's fine. Don't worry about it. And they're getting better at making it so all the lighting stuff works together. I'm more worried about data integrity than I am flashy, blinky lights. A reliable computer that you're happy with matters more. Like, I'm pretty sure a 1210 CPU with 64 gigs of RAM would down on Windows 11, definitely from Intel, would probably definitely outperform one with 32. I think it would make a noticeable difference in performance from what I've observed. And that's kind of CPU agnostic, because the operating system, it knows what it wants, and I wish they would optimize testing rather than just, well, this works. Well, that's great. Also explains why they didn't get a lot of performance uplift, but no one's pointing a thermal camera at the SSDs in the computer while they're at it either. Not that it would be a difference, I don't think it would be, but what I noticed was this usually what went up wasn't so much the peak frame rate, it was the average frame rate went up. You had fewer spikes, and that would make sense because you're not having to go through the SSD. But I'll just reiterate, 64 gigs of RAM. If you're running Windows 11, make sure to get like the 5 series. It's probably more than enough. Even Intel's 3 series is becoming pretty good. Don't put your games and your OS on the same disk drive. Don't put stuff that matters on refurbished disks. You don't know how much wear and tear they've had. I mean, you could dig into it, and it's a lot of work, and I'm trying to keep this not tech savvy. Just boring. Split things up, divvy up the labor on the computer, because we don't need all this from the disk cache going on. The whole talk to this, then talk to this, then talk to this, then talk to blah, 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 because I can't make up my mind, and then I need to go change this. Nah. It's much better if it doesn't have to do that as often, and it does become a noticeable thing. That's where a lot of your micro stutters and stuff come from, because the I/O controller, I don't know about the latency on these things, but I bet it's a lot higher than the few bits of, like the 10 or 20 you're getting rid of buying faster RAM. I bet there's a few hundred that's saved from not overloading this disk cache, because the CPU has to do less work, this has to do less work, and the RAM has to do less work, so it's doing more what you want it to do rather than housekeeping. You know, it's like putting a better door in your house. Saves energy, less dust, less housekeeping. That's how it works. Hopefully my similes make sense, at least some of you out there. And, well, thanks for everyone who stayed by. Hopefully it helps some of you. And hopefully I can actually read all the comments in these videos when they're in other languages. I'm stuck with Google Translate because I can only read and write in English. If you showed up with King James English, I probably could read it too, but I don't think there's many of you out there that speak and write in King James. Anyway, hopefully this kind of blog talking about it was helpful to some of you. And I'll see you guys next time.